Welcome back. We're doing story time with Loni when we're reading George Orwell's 1984, which is fantastic. We are not quite halfway through, but almost. Probably almost a third through, actually. And it's getting exciting. So tonight's chapters or tonight's sections, 1984 is broken up into 3 sections. Sometimes they're called books. We're in book 2, and then each of those sections is broken up into smaller sections, subsections, or sometimes they're called chapters. So we're in section 2, chapters 2, and hopefully 3. We'll see how it goes. And my policy on all books, regardless of what they are, is that we don't edit books and we don't edit the author's words or the author's content. That whatever their words were, whether they made them up or we don't think they're appropriate or we don't think the content is appropriate, they're there for a reason. And so we confront the authors where they are and where they brought us and see where they're going, because that's their point of view and these are their words. And you can censor your own words or you can change those, but you don't get to change them on behalf of other people. So with that said, tonight's content is a little intense. There are some sexual happenings, sex scenes tonight. Now, there's sex scenes that were written in 1950, so by today's standards, they're not as intense and maybe overt, obvious as other scenes, but they're still there. So if that is something that bothered you, or if that's something you feel like maybe your parents would not be okay with you listening to, I totally get that. Make sure that everybody is on board in reading this, but we're not going to censor the words of George Orwell, and it's kind of important to the plot, because sex and love and romance and whatever is not okay in 1984, in Orwell's 1984. And so it's one of those things where it's defiant and prohibited. And so just another way that our hero, is Winston a hero? I'm not sure. Just another way that our hero is defying the party and stretching that. So we're picking up tonight, section 2, chapter 2 of George Orwell's 1984. Winston picked his way up the lane through dappled light and shade, stepping out into pools of gold whenever the boughs parted. Under the trees to the left of them, the ground was misty with bluebells. The air seemed to kiss one's skin. It was the 2nd of May. Sorry, hold on. Sorry. The air seemed to kiss one's skin. It was the 2nd of May. From somewhere deeper in the heart of the wood came the droning of ringdoves. He was a bit early. There had been no difficulties about the journey, and the girl was so evidently experienced that he was less frightened than he would normally have been. Presumably, she could be trusted to find a safe place. In general, you could not assume that you were much safer in the country than in London. There were no telescreens, of course, but there was always the danger of concealed microphones by which your voice could be picked up and recognized. Besides, it was not easy to make a journey by yourself without attracting attention. For distances of less than 100 kilometers, it was not necessary to get your passport endorsed. But sometimes there were patrols hanging about the railway stations who examined the papers of any party member they found there and asked awkward questions. However, no patrols had appeared, and on the walk from the station he had made sure, by cautious backward glances, that he was not being followed. The train was full of Poles, in holiday mood because of the summery weather. The wooden-seated carriage in which he had traveled was filled to overflowing by a single enormous family, ranging from a toothless great-grandmother to a month-old baby, going out to spend an afternoon with the in-laws in the country, and, as they freely explained to Winston, to get hold of a little black market butter. The lane widened, and in a minute he came to the footpath she had told him of, a mere cattle track which plunged between the bushes. He had no watch, but it could not be 15 yet. The bluebells were so thick underfoot that it was impossible not to tread on them. He knelt down and began picking some, partly to pass the time away, but also from a vague idea that he would like to have a bunch of flowers to offer to the girl when they met. They got together a big bunch and was smelling their faint, sickly scent when a sound at his back froze him. The unmistakable crackle of a foot on twigs. He went on picking bluebells. It was the best thing to do. It might be the girl, or he might have been followed after all. To look round would show guilt. He picked another and another. A hand fell lightly on his shoulder. He looked up. It was the girl. She shook her head, evidently as a warning that he must keep silent, then parted the bushes and quickly led the way along the narrow track into the wood. Obviously, she had been that way before, for she dodged the boggy pits as though it were habit. Winston followed, still clasping his bunch of flowers. His first feeling was relief, but as he watched the strong, slender body moving in front of him, with a scarlet sash that was just tight enough to bring about the curve of her hips, his own sense of inferiority was heavy upon him. Even now, it seemed quite likely that when she turned round and looked at him, she would draw back after all. The sweetness of the air and the greenness of the leaves daunted him. Already on the walk from the station, the May sunshine had made him feel dirty and etiolated, a creature of the indoors. With the sooty dust of London in the pores of his skin. It occurred to him that till now she probably had never seen him in broad daylight in the open. They came to the fallen tree she had spoken of. The girl hopped over and forced apart the bushes, in which there did not seem to be an opening. Winston followed her. He found that they were in a natural clearing, a tiny grassy knoll surrounded by tall saplings that shut it in completely. The girl stopped and turned. "Here we are," she said. He was facing her at several paces distance, and yet he did not dare move nearer to her. "I didn't want to say anything in the lane," she went on, "in case there's a mic hidden there. I don't suppose there is, but there could be. There's always a chance of one of those swine recognizing your voice. We're all right here." He still had not the courage to approach her. "We're all right here?" he repeated stupidly. "Yes, look at the trees." They were small ashes, which at some time had been cut down and sprouted up again into a forest of poles, none of them thicker than one's wrist. "There's nothing big enough to hide a mic in. Besides, I've been here before." They were only making conversation. He had managed to move closer to her now. She stood before him, very upright, with a smile on her face that looked faintly ironical, as though she were wondering why he was so slow to act. The bluebells cascaded to the ground. They seemed to have fallen of their own accord. He took her hand. "Would you believe," he said, "that till this moment I didn't know what color your eyes were?" They were brown, he noted. A rather light shade of brown, with dark lashes. "Now that you've seen what I'm really like, can you still bear to look at me?" "Yes," evilly. "I'm 39 years old. I've got a wife that I can't get rid of. I've got varicose veins. I've got 5 false teeth." "I couldn't care less," said the girl. The next moment, it was hard to say by whose act she was in his arms. At the beginning, he had no feeling except sheer incredulity. The youthful body had strained against his own, a mass of dark hair against his face, and yes, actually she had turned her face up, and he was kissing the wide red mouth. She had clasped her arms around his neck, She was calling him darling, precious one, loved one. He had pulled her down onto the ground, and she was utterly unresisting. He could do what he liked with her. But the truth was that he had no physical sensation except that of mere contact. All he felt was incredulity and pride. He was glad that this was happening, but he had no physical desire. It was too soon. Her youth and her prettiness had frightened him. He was too much used to living without women. He did not know the reason. The girl picked herself up and pulled a bluebell out of her hair. She sat against him, putting her arm around his waist. Never mind, dear. There's no hurry. We've got the whole afternoon. Isn't this a splendid hideout? I found it when I got lost once on a community hike. If anyone was coming, you could hear them 100 meters away. What's your name? Said Winston. Julia. And I know yours. It's Winston Smith. How'd you find that out? I expect I'm better at finding things out than you are, dear. Tell me, what did you think of me before that day I gave you the note? He did not feel any temptation to tell lies to her. It was even a sort of love offering to start off by telling her the worst. I hated the sight of you, he said. I wanted to rape you and then murder you afterwards. 2 weeks ago, I thought seriously of smashing your head in with a cobblestone. Do you really want to know? I imagined that you had something to do with the thought police. The girl laughed delightedly, evidently taking this as a tribute to the excellence of her disguise. Not the thought police? You didn't honestly think that. Well, perhaps not exactly that, but from your general appearance, merely because you're young and fresh and healthy, you understand. I thought that probably you thought I was a good party member. Pure in word and deed. Banners, processions, slogans, games, community hikes, all that stuff. And you thought that if I had a quarter of a chance, I'd denounce you as a thought criminal and get you killed off? Yes, something like that. A great many young girls are like that, you know. It's this bloody thing that does it, she said, ripping off the scarlet sash of the Junior Anti-Sex League and flinging it onto a bow. Then, as though touching her waist had reminded her of something, she felt in the pocket of her overalls and produced a small slab of chocolate. She broke it in half and gave one of the pieces to Winston. Even before he had taken it, he knew by the smell of it it was very unusual chocolate. It was dark and shiny, and was wrapped in silver paper. Chocolate was normally dull brown, crumbly stuff that tasted, as nearly as one could describe it, like the smoke of a rubbish fire. But at some time or another, he had tasted chocolate like the piece she had given him. The first whiff of its scent had stirred up a memory which he could not pin down, but which was powerful and troubling. Where did you get this stuff? He said. Black market, she said indifferently. Actually, I am that sort of girl to look at, good at games. As a troop leader in the Spies, I do voluntary work 3 evenings a week for the Junior Anti-Sex League. Hours and hours I've spent pasting their bloody rot all over London. I always carry one end of a banner in a procession. I always look cheerful and never shirk anything. Always yell with the crowd, that's what I say. It's the only way to be safe. The first fragment of chocolate had melted on Winston's tongue. The taste was delightful. But there was still that memory moving on the edges of his consciousness, something strongly felt, reducible to definite shape, like an object seen out of the corner of one's eye. He pushed it away from him, aware only that it was a memory of some action which he would have liked to undo, but could not. You are very young, he said. You're 10 or 15 years younger than I am. What could you see to attract you in a man like me? Something in your face. Thought I'd take a chance. I'm good at spotting people who don't belong. As soon as I saw you, I knew you were against them. Them, it appeared, meant the party, and above all, the inner party, about whom she talked with an open, jeering hatred which made Winston feel uneasy. Although he knew that they were safe here, if they could be safe anywhere. The thing that astonished him about her was the coarseness of her language. Party members were supposed not to swear, and Winston himself very seldom did swear, aloud at any rate. Julia, however, seemed unable to mention the party, especially the inner party, without using the kind of words you saw chalked up in dripping alleyways. He did not dislike it. It was merely one symptom of her revolt against the party and all its ways, and somehow it seemed natural and healthy, like a sneeze of a horse that smells bad hay. They had left the clearing and were wandering again through the checkered shade, with their arms around each other's waist whenever it was wide enough to walk two abreast. He noticed how much softer her waist seemed to feel now that the sash was gone. He did not speak above a whisper. Outside the clearing, Julia said, it was better to go quietly. Presently, they had reached the edge of the little wood. She stopped him. Don't go out into the open. There might be someone watching. We're all right if we keep in the boughs. When they were standing in the shade of the hazel bushes, the sunlight, filtering through innumerable leaves, was still hot on their faces. Winston looked out into the field beyond and underwent a curious, slow shock of recognition. He knew it by sight. An old, close-bitten pasture, with a footpath wandering across it and a molehill here and there. And the ragged hedge on the opposite side of the boughs of the elms swayed just perceptibly in the breeze. Their leaves stirred faintly in dense masses like women's hair. Surely somewhere nearby, but out of sight. There must be a stream with green pools where dace were swimming. Isn't there a stream somewhere near here? That's right, there is a stream. It's at the edge of the next field, actually. There are fish in it, great big ones. You can watch them lying in the pools under the willow trees, waving their tails. It's the golden country. Almost, he murmured. The golden country? It's nothing, really. A landscape I've seen sometimes in a dream. Look, whispered Julia. A thrush had alighted on a bough not 5 meters away, almost at the level of their faces. Perhaps it had not seen them. It was in the sun, they in the shade. Spread out its wings, fitted them carefully into place again, ducked its head for a moment, as though making a sort of obeisance to the sun, then began to pour forth a torrent of song. In the afternoon hush, the volume of sound was startling. Winston and Julia clung together, fascinated. The music went on, minute after minute, with astonishing variations, never once repeating itself, almost as though the bird were deliberately showing off its virtuosity. Sometimes it stopped for a few seconds, spread out, resettled its wings, then swelled its speckled breast and again burst into song. Winston watched it with a sort of vague reverence. For whom, for what, was the bird singing? No mate, no rival was watching it. What made it sit at the edge of the lonely wood and pour its music into nothingness? He wondered whether, after all, there was a microphone hidden somewhere near. He and Julia had only spoken in low whispers, and it would not pick up what they had said, but it would pick up the thrush. Perhaps at the other end of the instrument was a small beetle-like man who was listening intensely, listening to that. But by degrees, the flood of music drove all speculations out of his mind. It was as though it were a kind of liquid stuff that poured all over him and got mixed up with the sunlight that filtered through the leaves. He stopped thinking and merely felt. The girl's waist was in the bend of his arm. The girl's waist in the bend of his arm was soft and warm. He pulled her round so that they were breast to breast. Her body seemed to melt into his. Wherever his hands moved, it was all as yielding as water. Their mouths clung together. It was quite different from the hard kisses they had exchanged earlier. When they moved their faces apart, both of them sighed deeply. The bird took fright and fled with a clatter of wings. Winston put his lips against her ear. Now, he whispered. Not here, she whispered back. Come back to the hideout. It's safer. Quickly, with an occasional crackle of twigs, they threaded their way back to the clearing. When they were once again in the ring of saplings, she turned and faced him. They were both breathing fast, but the smile had reappeared round the corners of her mouth. She stood looking at him for an instant, then felt at the zipper of her overalls. Ah, yes, it was almost as in his dream. Almost as swiftly as he had imagined, she had torn her clothes off, and when she had flung them aside, it was with the same magnificent gesture by which a whole civilization seemed to be annihilated. Her body gleamed white in the sun, but for a moment he did not look at her body. His eyes were anchored on the freckled face with its faint, bold smile. He knelt down before her and took her hands in his. Have you done this before? Of course, hundreds of times. Well, scores of times anyway. With party members? Yes, always with party members. With members of the inner party? Not those swine, no. But there's plenty that would if they got half the chance. They're not so holy as they make out. His heart leapt. Scores of times she had done it. He wished it had been hundreds, thousands. Anything that hinted at corruption always filled him with a wild hope. Who knew? Perhaps the party was rotten under the surface. Its cult of strenuousness and self-denial simply a sham concealing iniquity. If he could have infected the whole lot of them with leprosy or syphilis, how gladly he would have done so. Anything to rot, to weaken, to undermine. He pulled her down so that they were kneeling face to face. Listen, the more men you've had, the more I love you. Do you understand that? Yes, perfectly. I hate purity. I hate goodness. I don't want any virtue to exist anywhere. I want everyone to be corrupt to the bones. Well, then I ought to suit you, dear. I'm corrupt to the bones. You like doing this? I don't simply mean me. I mean the thing itself. I adore it. That was, above all, what he wanted to hear. Not merely the love of one person, but the animal instinct, the simple, undifferentiated desire. That was the force that would tear the party to pieces. He pressed her down upon the grass, among the fallen bluebells. This time there was no difficulty. Presently the rising and falling of their breaths slowed to normal speed. In a sort of pleasant helplessness they fell apart. The sun seemed to have grown hotter. They were both sleepy. He reached out for the discarded overalls and pulled them partly over her. Almost immediately they fell asleep and slept for half an hour. Winston woke first. He sat and watched her freckled face, still peacefully asleep, pillowed in the palm of her hand. Except for her mouth, you could not call her beautiful. There was a line or two around the eyes if you looked closely. The short, dark hair was extraordinarily thick and soft. It occurred to him that he did not know her surname or where she lived. The young, strong body, now helpless in sleep, awoke him a pitying, protective feeling. But the mindless tenderness that he had felt under the hazel tree while the thrush was singing did not quite come back. He pulled the overalls aside and studied her smooth, white flank. In the old days, he thought, a man looked at a girl's body and saw that it was desirable, and that was the end of the story. But you could not have a pure love or a pure lust nowadays. No emotion was pure, because everything was mixed up with fear and hatred. Their embrace had been a battle, the climax of victory. It was a blow struck against the party. It was a political act. Chapter 3. We can come here once again, said Julia. It's generally safe to use a hideout twice. But not for another month or two, of course. As soon as she woke up, her demeanor had changed. She became alert and businesslike, put her clothes on, knotted the scarlet sash about her waist, and began arranging the details of the journey home. It seemed natural to leave this to her. She obviously had a practical cunning which Winston lacked, and she seemed also to have an exhaustive knowledge of the countryside around London, stored away from innumerable community hikes. The route she gave him was quite different from the one by which he had come, and brought him out a different railway at a different railway station. Never go home the same way you went out, she said, as though enunciating an important general principle. She would leave first, and Winston was to wait half an hour before following her. She had named a place where they could meet after work, 4 evenings hence. It was a street on one of the poorer quarters, where there was an open market which was generally crowded and noisy. She would be hanging about among the stalls, pretending to be in search of shoelaces or sewing thread. If she judged that the coast was clear, she would blow her nose when he approached. Otherwise, he was to walk past her without recognition. But with luck, in the middle of the crowd, it would be safe to talk for a quarter of an hour and arrange another meeting. And now I must go, she said as soon as he had mastered his instructions. I'm due back at 19:30. I've got to put in 2 hours at the Junior Anti-Sex League, handing out leaflets or something. Isn't it bloody? Give me a brush down, would you? Have I got any twigs in my hair? Are you sure? Then goodbye, my love, goodbye. She flung herself into his arms, kissed him almost violently, and a moment later pushed her way through the saplings and disappeared into the wood with very little noise. Even now, he had not found out her surname or her address. However, it made no difference, for it was inconceivable that they could ever meet indoors or exchange any kind of written communication. As it happened, they never went back to the clearing in the wood. During the month of May, there was only one further occasion on which they actually succeeded in making love, and that was another hiding place known to Julia, the belfry of a ruined church in an almost deserted stretch of country where an atomic bomb had fallen 30 years earlier. It was a good hiding place once you got there, but the getting there was very dangerous. For the rest, they could meet only in the streets, and in a different place every evening, and never for more than half an hour at a time. In the street, it was usually possible to talk after a fashion. As they drifted down on the crowded pavements, not quite abreast and never looking at one another, they carried on a curious, intermittent conversation, which flicked on and off like beams of a lighthouse, suddenly nipped into silence by approach of a party uniform or the proximity of a telescreen, then taken up again minutes later in the middle of a sentence, then abruptly cut short as they parted at the agreed-upon spot, then continued almost without introduction on the following day. Julia appeared to be quite used to this kind of conversation, which she called talking by installments. She was also surprisingly adept at speaking without moving her lips. Just once in almost a month of nightly meetings, they managed to exchange a kiss. They were passing in silence down a side street. Julia would never speak when they were away from the main streets. When there was a deafening roar, the earth heaved and the air darkened, and Winston found himself lying on his side, bruised and terrified. A rocket bomb must have dropped quite near at hand. Suddenly he became aware of Julia's face a few centimeters from his own, deathly white as chalk. Even her lips were white. She was dead. Clasped her against him and found that he was kissing a live, warm face. But there was some powdery stuff that got in the way of his lips. Both their faces were quickly coated with plaster. There were evenings when they reached their rendezvous and then had to walk past one another without a sign because a patrol had just come around the corner or a helicopter was hovering overhead. Even if it had been less dangerous, it would still have been difficult to find time to meet. Winston's working week was 60 hours. Julia's was even longer, and their free days, varied according to the pressure of work, did not coincide. Julia, in any case, seldom had an evening completely free. She spent an astonishing amount of time attending lectures and demonstrations, distributing literature for the Junior Anti-Sex League, preparing banners for Hate Week, making collections for the savings campaigns, and such like activities. But Paige, she said, it was camouflage. If you kept the small rules, you could break the big ones. She even introduced Winston to mortgage yet another of his evenings by enrolling himself for the part-time munition work, which was done voluntarily by zealous party members. So one evening every week, Winston spent 4 hours of paralyzing boredom, screwing together small bits of metal, which were probably parts of bomb fuses, in a drafty, ill-lit shop, where the knocking of hammers mingled drearily with the music of telescreens. When they met in the church tower, the gaps in their fragmentary conversation were filled up. It was a blazing afternoon. The air of the little square chamber above the bell was hot and stagnant. It smelled overpoweringly of pigeon dung. They sat talking for hours on the dusty, twig-littered floor, one or the other of them getting up from time to time to cast a glance through the narrow slits and make sure that no one was coming. Julia was 26 years old. She lived in a hostel with 30 other girls. Always in the stink of women. How I hate women, she said parenthetically. And she worked, as he had guessed, on the novel writing machines in the fiction department. She enjoyed her work, which consisted chiefly of running and servicing a powerful but tricky electric motor. She was not clever, but was fond of using her hands and felt at home with machinery. She could describe the whole process of composing a novel, from the general directive issued by the planning committee down to the final touching up by the rewrite squad. But she was not interested in the finished product. She didn't much care for reading, she said. Books were just a commodity. Books were just a commodity that had to be produced, like jam or bootlaces. She had no memories of anything before the early 60s, and the only person she had ever known who talked frequently of the days before the revolution was a grandfather who had disappeared when she was 8. At school, she had been captain of the hockey team and had won the gymnastics trophy 2 years running. She had been a troop leader in the Spies and a branch secretary in the youth league before joining the junior anti-sex league. She had always borne an excellent character. She had even, an infallible mark of good reputation, been picked out to work in pornosec, a subsection of the fiction department which turned out cheap pornography for distribution amongst the Poles. It was nicknamed Muck House by the people who worked in it, she remarked. There she had remained for a year, helping to produce booklets and sealed packets with titles like Spanking Stories or One Night in a Girls' School, to be bought furtively for proletarian youths who were under the impression that they were buying something illegal. What are those books like? Said Winston curiously. Oh, ghastly rubbish. They're boring, really. They only have 6 plots, but they swap them round a bit. Of course, I was only on the kaleidoscopes. I was never in the rewrite squad. I'm not literary, dear. Not even enough of that. We had learned with astonishment that all of the workers in the pornosec, except the head of the department, were girls. The theory was that men whose sex instincts were less controllable than those of women were in greater danger of being corrupted by the filth they handled. They didn't even like having married women there, she added. Girls are always supposed to be so pure. Here's one who isn't anyway. She had had her first love affair when she was 16 with a party member of 60 who later committed suicide to avoid arrest. And a good job, too, said Julia. Otherwise, they'd have had my name out of him when he confessed. Since then, there had been various others. Life, as she saw it, was quite simple. You wanted a good time. They, meaning the party, wanted to stop you from having it. You broke the rules, as best you could. She seemed to think it was just as natural that they should want to rob you of your pleasures as you should want to avoid being caught. She hated the party, and said so in the crudest words, but she made no general criticism. But she made no general criticism of it. Except where it touched upon her life, she had no interest in party doctrine. He noticed that she never used newspeak words, except the ones that passed into everyday use. She had never heard of the Brotherhood and refused to believe in its existence. Any kind of organized revolt against the party, which was bound to be a failure, struck her as stupid. The clever thing was to break the rules and stay alive all at the same time. He wondered vaguely how many others like her there might be in the younger generations, people who had grown up in the world of the revolution, knowing nothing else, accepting the party as something unalterable, like the sky, not rebelling against its authority, but simply evading it, like a rabbit dodges a dog. They did not discuss the possibility of getting married. It was too remote to be worth talking about. No imaginable committee could ever sanction such a marriage, even if Catherine, Winston's wife, could somehow have been gotten rid of. It was hopeless, even as a daydream. "What was she like, your wife?" said Julia. "She was—" Do you know the Newspeak word "thinkful"? Meaning naturally orthodox. Incapable of thinking about that? No, I don't know the word, but I know the kind of person right enough. He began telling her the story of his married life, but curiously enough, she appeared to know the essential parts of it already. She described to him, almost as though she had seen or felt it, the stiffening of Catherine's body as soon as he touched her, the way in which she still seemed to be pushing him from her with all her strength, even when her arms were clasped tightly around him. With Julia, he felt no difficulty in talking about such things. Catherine, in any case, had long ceased to be a painful memory and had become merely a distasteful one. "I could have stood it if it hadn't been for one thing," he said. He told her about the frigid little ceremony that Catherine had forced him to go through on the same night every week. She hated it, but nothing could make her stop doing it. She used to call it, but you'll never guess. "Our duty to the party," said Julia promptly. "How'd you know about that?" "I've been at school too, dear. Sex talks once a month for the over-16s, and in the youth movement. They rub it into you for years. I dare say it works in a lot of cases. But of course, you can never tell. People are such hypocrites." She began to enlarge upon the subject. With Julia, everything came back to her own sexuality. As soon as this was touched upon in any way, she was capable of great acuteness. Unlike Winston, she had grasped the inner meaning of the party's sexual puritanism. It was not merely that sex was instinct created in a world of its own, which was outside the party's control, and which, therefore, had to be destroyed if possible. What was more important was that sexual privatation induced hysteria, which was desirable because it could be transformed into war fever and leader worship. The way she put it was, when you make love, you're using up energy, and afterwards you feel happy and don't give a damn for anything. And they can't bear you to feel like that. They want you to be bursting with energy all the time. All of this marching up and down and cheering and waving flags is simply sex gone sour. If you're happy inside yourself, why should you get excited about Big Brother or 3-year plans or 2 minutes hate and all the rest of their bloody rot? That was very true, he thought. There was a direct, intimate connection between chastity and political orthodoxy. For how could the fear and hatred, the lunatic credulity which the party needed in its members, be kept at the right pitch except by bottling down some powerful instinct and using it as a driving force? The sex impulse was dangerous to the party, and the party had turned it to account. They had played a similar trick with the instinct of parenthood. The family could not actually be abolished, and indeed, people were encouraged to be fond of their children in an almost old-fashioned way. The children, on the other hand, were systematically turned against their parents and taught to spy on them and thwart their deviations. The family had become, in effect, an extension of the thought police. It was a device by means of which everyone could be surrounded night and day by informers who knew him intimately. I'll grab my charger. Hold on just a second. Sorry about that. I was afraid my computer was going to go dead with 2 pages to go. Abruptly, his mind went back to Catherine. Catherine would unquestionably have denounced him to the thought police if she had not happened to be too stupid to detect his unorthodoxy, the unorthodoxy of his opinions. But what really recalled her to him at that moment was the stifling heat of the afternoon, which had brought the sweat on his forehead. He began telling Julia of something that had happened, or rather, had failed to happen, on another sweltering summer afternoon 11 years ago. It was 3 or 4 months after they were married, and they had lost their way on a community hike somewhere in Kent. They'd only lagged behind the others for a couple of minutes, but they took a wrong turning and presently found themselves pulled up short on the edge of an old chalk quarry. It was a sheer drop of 10 or 20 meters with boulders at the bottom. There was nobody of whom they could talk or ask the way. As soon as she realized that they were lost, Catherine became very uneasy. To be away from the noisy mob of hikers, even for a moment, gave her the feeling of wrongdoing. She wanted to hurry back by the way that they had come and start searching in another direction. But at this moment, Winston noticed some tufts of loose strife growing in the cracks of the cliff below them. One tuft was of 2 colors, magenta and brick red, apparently growing out of the same root. They had never seen anything of the kind before. He called Catherine to come back and look at it. "Look, Catherine, look at these flowers. That clump down there near the bottom. Don't you see that they're 2 different colors?" She had already turned to go, but did rather fretfully come back for a moment. She even leaned out over the cliff face to see where he was pointing. He was standing a little behind her, and he put his hand on her waist to steady her. At this moment, it suddenly occurred to him how completely alone they were. There was not a human creature anywhere, not a leaf stirring, not even a bird awake. In a place like this, the danger that there would be a hidden microphone was very small. And even if there was a microphone, it would only pick up sounds. It was the hottest, sleepiest hour of the afternoon. The sun blazed down upon them, the sweat tickled his face, and the thought struck him. "Why didn't you give her a good shove?" said Julia. "I would have." "Yes, dear, you would have. I would have, if I'd been the same person I am now. Or perhaps I would, I'm not certain." "Are you sorry you didn't?" "Yes. On the whole, I'm sorry I didn't." They were sitting side by side on the dusty floor. He pulled her closer against him. Her head rested on his shoulder, the pleasant smell of her hair conquering the pigeon dung. She was very young, he thought. She still expected something from life. She did not understand that to push an inconvenient person over a cliff solves nothing. "Actually, it would have made no difference," he said. "Then why are you sorry you didn't do it?" "Only because I prefer a positive to a negative. In this game that we're playing, we can't win. Some kinds of failure are better than other kinds, that's all." He felt her shoulders give a wriggle of dissent. She always contradicted when he said anything of this kind. She would not accept it as law of nature that the individual is always defeated. In a way, she realized that she herself was doomed, that sooner or later the thought police would catch up and kill her. With another part of her mind, she believed that it was somehow possible to construct a secret world in which you could live as you choose. All you needed was luck and cunning and boldness. She did not understand that there was no such thing as happiness, that the only victory lay in the far future, long after you were dead, that from the moment of declaring war on the party, it is better to think of yourself as a corpse. "We are the dead," he said. "We're not dead yet," said Julia prosaically. "Not physically, 6 months, a year, 5 years, conceivably." "I'm afraid of death. You are young, so presumably you're more afraid of it than I am. Obviously, we shall part. We shall put it off as long as we can, but it makes little difference. So long as human beings stay human, death and life are the same thing. Oh, rubbish. Which would you sooner sleep with, me or a skeleton? Don't you enjoy being alive? Don't you like feeling? This is me. This is my hand. This is my leg. I'm real. I'm solid. I'm alive. Don't you like this? She twisted herself round and pressed her bosom against him. He could feel her breast, bright yet firm, through her overalls. Her body seemed to be pouring some of its youth and vigor into his. Yes, I like that, he said. And stop talking about dying. Now listen, dear. We've got to fix up about the next time we meet. We may as well go back to the place in the wood. We've given it a good long rest. But you must get there by a different way this time. I've got it all planned out. You take the train, but look, I'll draw it out for you. And in her practical way, she scraped together a small square of dust, and with a twig from a pigeon's nest, began drawing a map on the floor. That's the end of chapter 3. We'll do chapter 4 tomorrow.